Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I've done a couple of videos lately where I've discussed the Druid spell list, and I've mentioned it has a lot of pretty good options in it. As I've mentioned in the past, I've had a few conversations with people who've basically simplified down the Druid spell list to describe the value of Druid spellcasting as conjure animals, conjure animals, conjure animals, and without conjure animals, the Druid is a substandard caster. I think those players are missing a tremendous amount of amazing spells through all levels, and I kind of equate this thinking very similarly to the thinking that wizards are all about fireballs. And like with wizards and fireballs, I think a druid has a deep enough spell list to be a great spellcaster without touching conjure animals at all. So this series is dedicated to those players. If you would like to support this content, please check the link in the video description for my Patreon. Patrons of this channel see these videos early and non-monetized, and my top level patrons can join me to play some D&D every month. Today I'd like to recognize these top level patrons: Scott J. Smith, Sig, Stephen Edmondson, TUM, Tazel, Thomas Barrero, Thomas Van Lursel, Tristan, and Tristan Bello. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. Today we're going to start to go through the Druid spell list. I'm going to be ranking every spell using my standard rating system. Here's how that works. If I rank a spell as red, I think it's a bad spell, and I wouldn't recommend it for preparation on basically any Druid. If I rank a spell as orange, I think it's a very circumstantial spell. This is a spell I wouldn't recommend to prepare normally, but there are situations where it will come in handy. And if we know those situations are likely to present themselves, in those cases these spells can be very effective. If I rank a spell as purple, I think the spell is okay. They're likely not the first spells I'm personally going to prepare, or at least as my primary selections, but I do think you can get reasonable value from them if you do prepare them. If I rank a spell as green, I think it's a good spell. This is the kind of spell I would consider very strongly when choosing my spell preparations. This isn't necessarily a must-have, but if you do prepare it, you're likely going to get the chance to use it, and you should get good value from it. If I rank a spell as blue, then I think it's a fantastic spell. I would have a hard time passing up the chance to prepare a blue spell. These spells are the best of the best. If you're colorblind, I'll be adding stars to the end of each rating: 1 for red, 2 for orange, 3 for purple, 4 for green, and 5 for blue, so it should be easy to discern the color ranking. And if you're just listening, no problem. I'll be announcing each rating as well. And I'm just going to go through these in alphabetical order. Today we are discussing cantrips. The first cantrip is Control Flames. This is a utility cantrip that has a number of uses. You can cause non-magical fires to spread in the direction you choose, extinguish a non-magical fire up to a 5-foot cube at a time, double or halve the light cast by non-magical flames for an hour, or create simple images and shapes within a non-magical flame, again lasting an hour. Although we can cast this cantrip over and over, we're limited to having 3 of any of the 1-hour effects active at one time. That's actually more than other cantrips that have a similar kind of effect. We'll talk about those later. And you can use an action to dismiss any of those effects. The effect I find that will come up the most often is doubling the light of a flame, because you can do this to a lantern or a torch, and then you get this huge radius of light. If you're not relying on dark vision, there should be more than enough light to ensure no enemies are, hanging out beyond the edge of the light and using their own dark vision to get advantage on attacks or disadvantage on your attacks. The other features are far more circumstantial, but I wouldn't say any of them are useless. I just wouldn't count on any of them to come up a lot. So I do think this spell ranks orange. It may be useful here and there. I think it's going to be a lot more useful in a party that doesn't rely on dark vision, but I wouldn't count on it being something that comes up a lot. Our second cantrip is Create Bonfire. To a large extent, this is just a save or take damage cantrip. And as with most save or take damage cantrips, we're looking at 60 feet of range. The damage is fairly average at 1d8 fire damage, and it has a standard cantrip scaling and uses a dexterity save. Where this spell differs is that the bonfire remains in the spot you cast it, and it requires your concentration to cast. What I find is that the concentration requirement is going to be a bigger and bigger downside as you increase in level, and you're more and more likely to be concentrating on something else. Also, the Druid spell list is not light on concentration spells. The bonfire remaining, though, does mean you might be able to damage with it more than once, especially if you can either force enemy movement or prevent enemy movement. Despite this, however, it's still just doing cantrip damage, and even then only if they fail their save. And because the Druid spell list is so heavily geared towards using your concentration, I expect that conflict is just going to come up a little too often to recommend a cantrip that uses concentration as well. So for that reason, I am going to marginally give this a red rating. I think there's an argument to be made that it might be orange, but I am leaning towards the red side. Druidcraft is a Druid utility cantrip, and this is one of those more flexible and generic cantrips along the same line as Thaumaturgy or Prestidigitation. In this case, we can use this cantrip to predict the weather, cause plants to blossom or bloom, create a small and harmless sensory effect that is nature related. So maybe the sound of an animal, the smell of a flower, or the sound of a breeze, for example. And finally, we could use it to light or snuff out a small fire. Some of this, honestly, is just not going to be useful. Causing flowers to bloom is certainly thematic for a druid, but let's be honest, it's not going to have a significant mechanical effect in gameplay. Creating a sensory effect might, though. Just an example, goblins who hear the sounds of wolves howling outside their lair are unlikely to ignore that. So there are useful aspects to this spell, but I don't think they're coming up a lot. So this one, for me, is orange. Frostbite is our next cantrip, and this is another save or take damage cantrip. As normal, we have a 60-foot range, and in this case, the damage type is cold, and the enemy is getting a constitution save to ignore the effect. We have a secondary effect with this cantrip, that if the enemy fails their saving throw, they also have disadvantage on their next weapon attack on their turn. The base damage and save of this are not very good. Constitution is the last saving throw we generally want to target, and a d6 is below average for cantrips. So if we take Frostbite, we're probably taking it for the secondary effect, which honestly is never terrible, but it's definitely better at earlier levels when most creatures are only attacking once on their turn. Overall, this one is okay. It's a below average spell in regards to damage and saving throw, but the secondary effect is pretty decent. Frostbite, for me, gets a purple rating and a modest recommendation. Our next cantrip is Guidance, which is a touch spell that provides a target a d4 bonus on the ability check of their choice while the spell lasts. The spell lasts for up to 1 minute and requires your concentration. This is usually a utility spell that is used outside of combat, meaning it is less likely to interfere with other concentration spells, though sometimes druids are concentrating on spells outside of combat as well. And the use of this comes up all the time. Whether searching or investigating, you could be checking for traps, picking locks, using stealth, climbing, swimming, jumping, using social skills. It's pretty much endless the number of times this cantrip could come up. And that's why I think it's potentially the best cantrip in the game, or at worst, one of the best. So this is the blue cantrip on the Druid spell list. This is going to be my first cantrip selection on most druids I make. Next cantrip is Gust, which is a utility and combat control cantrip that allows us some control over air within 30 feet of us. We can use it for 3 different effects. The first is to force a medium or smaller creature to make a strength saving throw or be pushed 5 feet away from us. Second is pushing an object of no more than 5 pounds up to 10 feet away from us. And the third is to create an appropriate sensory effect, such as rustling of leaves or causing clothing to blow in the breeze. If all these effects seem pretty small and ineffectual to you, well, you have my agreement there. This just doesn't have enough, and I just can't recommend it. It has to have a red rank for me. Next cantrip is Infestation. This is an attack, save, or take damage cantrip. Couple notable things here is that instead of the standard 60-foot range for these kinds of spells, we get only 30 feet for some reason, and this does poison damage, which is notorious as the least reliable damage type in the game. Add on, it targets the worst save to target, Constitution, and does less than average damage for cantrips of this type at a d6 with the standard cantrip scaling, and it's looking just awful. If it fails its saving throw, it does move 5 feet as well, but the direction is random, and it doesn't provoke opportunity attacks, so the tactical applications for this become far more limited. This one, I would say, is just straight bad. I imagine most of you will agree this deserves nothing but a red ranking. Magic Stone is our next cantrip. This one is a little harder to rank. This is one of the rare bonus action cantrips. When we cast it, we enchant up to 3 pebbles, and they can be thrown or hurled with a sling as a ranged spell attack for a d6 damage plus our wisdom modifier. Whomever throws them uses our spellcasting modifier to their spell attack roll rather than their own ability score. The enchantment lasts for 1 minute, and if you cast it again, any previous enchantment ends. So I find this cantrip gets a lot of discussion because it doesn't specify any limits on who might throw those stones. And you can use your bonus action and cast this, and then have, a tiny servant that the wizard might have conjured, which is what I hear about most commonly, or 3 other minor creatures of any type throwing these stones. That's 3 attacks from 3 creatures that normally might not attack at all, so in essence that could be 3 attacks as a bonus action. Now this spell doesn't confer any special ability to the thrower to throw rocks if it normally couldn't, or at least it doesn't say it does, so I suspect you need to at least have a creature that could reasonably throw rocks to begin with. Secondly, it's important to remember that they're not using your spell attack modifier. They use their own proficiency bonus plus your casting modifier. So if you use this strategy, remember that may mean their chance to hit may not be as high as if you threw the stones. Also, I think there are a lot of assumptions, especially combining this with the Tiny Servant spell, about the complexity of general ongoing commands that can be given to a creature with an intelligence score of 2. So I don't think you should count on this strategy working at all, at least before a conversation with your DM. But let's say, you have some commoners following your party, for example. I think very clearly they could throw the stones for you. Now we're looking at 2 plus your wisdom modifier to hit, 4 1d6 plus your wisdom modifier and damage, 3 times per turn, and you're just using your bonus action. That's pretty darn good for a cantrip. But you also just turn those commoners into targets, and they're pretty easy kills, so keep that in mind as well. As for using this cantrip as a straight attack cantrip, as in you use your bonus action to create the stones, then your next 3 actions to throw them, then I think you'll find levels 1 through 4, this actually does decent damage, but it doesn't scale like other attack cantrips. So as other cantrips are doubling, tripling, and finally quadrupling base damage, this is only scaling with the increase in your wisdom score, and not by much. So other than early levels, the use of Magic Stone is pretty crappy actually. So this cantrip can be effective if you happen to have the right situation, and or you can get DM buy-in for creating that situation for yourself. But barring that, then it's still okay at low levels, but not so good as we level up. I mean, we're not really using our bonus action that often at those low levels, and a d6 plus wisdom damage is still more than we would get with a standard d8 or even a d10 cantrip. But after level 5, then unless we have a way to have something else with available actions throw those stones, it's not worth it as a personal attack cantrip. But with Tasha's, we can select a cantrip for low levels, and then we can switch it out when we get an ability score increase, like we do at level 4. So, since I think we do better damage than most cantrips with this at low levels, and because we can either switch it out or find a way to use it effectively afterwards, I'm inclined towards a purple ranking. But again, think about whether you want to keep it when level 4 comes up. And as I said, this one's hard to rank because there are certainly situations where I think it's better than purple. And there are certainly situations where I think it's worse than purple. Purple is kind of where I'm averaging it out. Mending is our next cantrip. This one is pure utility with 1 minute casting time. The Mending cantrip repairs a single break or tear in an object as long as that break or tear is no larger than 1 foot in any direction. I find this cantrip comes up reasonably often. An object gets damaged, and then the spell can repair that damage. Or we find a damaged object, and the spell can repair it. The most common misconception I find about this spell is that Mending cannot fix any kind of damage just by casting it multiple times. If you have a break or tear over 1 foot in dimensions, this spell does nothing. And if the damage isn't a break or tear, again, this cantrip does nothing, no matter how many times you cast it. Still, as simple utility, I find it comes up. And it's okay, and so I think it's purple. But it is kind of on the orange border, depending how often the situations come up where this is useful. And I think you could reasonably argue it's an orange cantrip. But based on my own experience, I find it comes up often enough to give it a purple. This video is sponsored by Describe. Describe is a service that provides you box text for monsters, spells, items, characters, and other observations for the DM to read to the players. Great box text can really add to the mood and immersion of a scene, and Describe has a team of writers with credits, including the works of Wizards of the Coast, Fantasy Flight Games, Green Ronin, Chaosium, Microsoft Studios, Dragon Magazine, Bungie, and other reputable publishers. Describe offers a service that is constantly expanding, with thousands of options at your fingertips, with more being added constantly. How many more? Well, when I was first contacted by Describe regarding video sponsorship less than a month ago, there were over 2,700 selections available. Now there's over 3,000. Check out these interactive maps. This one is of a roadside carnival. As we float our cursor over different features, the box text appears that describe the scene to players, whether they're inspecting the main tent, or the woodpile, the roadside well, or they peer into the depths of the well itself. Should they come back at night, we can switch the map, and the descriptions change to match the time of day, including some interesting activity in that well that might just spark some exploration. Describe currently has several such maps, and you can access the interactive versions and download them for use at your table or on your virtual tabletop for the players. Visit Describe in the link in the video description, and don't forget to use the coupon code TreantMonk for 10% off your initial subscription. Mold Earth is our next cantrip. This spell is utility and potentially battlefield control in combat. This allows us to manipulate up to a 5-foot cube of earth or stone within 30 feet as an action. First thing we can do, and probably the biggest thing we can do, is excavate loose earth and deposit it 5 feet away. The second is to cause shapes, colors, or both to appear in the targeted earth or stone. This lasts for 1 hour. Or we can turn that dirt or stone into difficult terrain, or turn difficult terrain of earth or stone into normal terrain. This change also lasts for 1 hour. If you cast this multiple times, you can only have 2 of the 1 hour effects active at one time, and you dismiss them using your action. So this is pretty minor stuff, except for the big one, which we hear about all the time. Excavating a 5-foot pit and creating a 5-foot pile of cover as an action. The big question is what counts as loose earth? Does packed dirt still count as loose earth? Well, according to Jeremy Crawford, by loose earth, they meant dirt, not stone. So you can excavate dirt, whether it's packed or not. The way I interpret it is, if you could reasonably excavate it with a shovel, you can probably excavate it with the Mold Earth spell, only much faster. So how often do we have a combat where we're standing on dirt? Well, if we're inside, almost never. Most floors are not dirt floors. If we're in a cave or the Underdark, we're probably standing on stone. If we're outside, though, then there should be a reasonable chance. Not all the time, mind you, but a reasonable chance. And when this does come up, it's pretty good, especially for a cantrip. Creating 5 feet of cover with an action is often going to be an action well spent, especially at lower levels. And I think it really is campaign dependent. Some campaigns have combats outdoors a lot, others not at all. So this one, I'm going to give it orange. It is quite good in the right circumstance, but I think that's largely a campaign dependent circumstance, and there is some chance that circumstance will never come up. So I can't justify any more than orange. Our next cantrip is Poison Spray. This one is a save or take damage attack cantrip. The range here is unusually terrible for this kind of spell. Usually these kinds of spells are giving us 60 feet in range. This one is 10 feet. That is bad. Secondly, we're doing poison damage, which is the least reliable damage type. And thirdly, we're targeting the last save we want to target, Constitution. The one and only saving grace of this cantrip is the damage is as high as we could hope for. A d12 that has cantrip scaling. So when we are in range, and if a creature does fail their save, and if they aren't resistant or immune to poison, then d12 scaling is high damage for a cantrip. Is that enough to make up for the downsides? Not in my opinion. So as far as I'm concerned, this is still red. Our next cantrip is Primal Savagery, which is our first melee attack cantrip. Primal Savagery does acid damage and does a d10 damage with a standard cantrip scaling. One thing that I find disappointing here is there is no secondary effect. So it's just do the damage and that's it. Still, the damage is decent for an attack cantrip, and acid isn't a poor damage type. And in my experience, you can land attack roll cantrips more commonly than save or take damage cantrips. So I think this one is passable. No more than that, but it does fair damage as far as cantrips are concerned. So I think it merits a purple rank. Our next cantrip is Produce Flame. This is kind of a ranged attack cantrip and kind of a utility cantrip. It's honestly a bit weird. So first off, you can use this to create light. You need a free hand to hold that light, and the range of the light is pretty terrible actually. 10-foot bright light, 10-foot dim light. That's half of a torch. Also, we can't use Control Flame to increase that, since this is magical fire. The flame can then be thrown, either with the same action used to create it, or an action on a later turn. If you do so, the range is bad. I mean 30-foot range, so really bad. So bad that we will actually be comparing this to a melee attack cantrip that has the same range, except no disadvantage if we're actually in melee. And it does a d8 fire damage that has a standard cantrip scaling, so that's middle of the road. The only secondary effect for throwing the flame is you just lost your light source. So if that's what you were using it for, that's pretty bad. So I'm no fan of this cantrip. I think it's pretty cool to have a flame you're holding in your hand that you can later throw. And there are things they could have done to make it worthwhile. But, you know, this needed to replace itself immediately after you threw it so you didn't lose your light source. And it probably should do a d10 damage. And it probably should have had a 90 or 120 foot range. So this comes up short, in my view, on a few fronts. So I have to give it a red. Resistance is our next cantrip. In a lot of ways, this is actually very similar to Guidance, except instead of boosting ability checks, we're boosting saving throws. So you target one creature when you cast a spell, which lasts up to a minute, with your concentration, and that creature can apply a d4 to one saving throw of their choice before the spell ends. Now, saving throws are often very high stakes, more so than ability checks, I would say, at least most of the time. So why all the love for Guidance and not so much for Resistance? And that comes down to how often it's coming up. Guidance comes up constantly, and we often know when we're going to be making an ability check, and we often have a chance to prepare for that ability check beforehand. But with saving throws, that's just normally not the case. Now in combat, just like with Guidance, I think the concentration requirement here makes this a substandard choice for Druids. So instead, what we're left with is guessing when, outside of combat, we might be making a saving throw. And that tends to lead to a whole lot of guesswork. And regardless, it just comes up way less often. So this is orange, because a saving throw can be really important. and a D4 is actually a very decent bonus on a saving throw, but it just isn't something we can predict easily, and it doesn't come up often enough to provide a higher rating. Shape Water is our next cantrip. This has similarities to Gust, Control Flames, and Mold Earth, but this time we're manipulating up to a 5-foot cube of water. We can move or change the flow of water we target up to 5 feet in any direction. We can do the standard shapes that can be seen in the water. This lasts for 1 hour, and the one thing a little different here is that the images we create can move. We can also change the color or opacity of the water for up to an hour, and we can freeze the targeted water again up to an hour. As with the other similar spells, if we are creating effects with a duration, we can only have 2 of them active at one time, and we can dismiss the effects with an action. So first let's talk utility. Minor use of creating images, of course, just like all the other cantrips that create images, and as you can see there are quite a lot of them. Freezing cubes of water might allow you to move slowly over water, creating new cubes of ice as you move along the surface. Changing the flow of water might allow a small boat to move upstream easier, and there's some possible combat uses as well. A frozen cube of water might give you full cover as an action, so that's quite useful. Opaque water might provide obscurement. The main drawback here is, of course, only in water. Do D&D challenges sometimes involve water? Yes. Do D&D combats ever take place in water? Yes. Are either of these common? No. So this is orange. It's occasionally quite useful, but occasionally. Generally speaking, if I knew the campaign would be largely in or on the water, maybe a seafaring campaign, I'd be inclined to choose this over Mold Earth. Otherwise, I'd be inclined to choose Mold Earth over this. Our next cantrip is Shillelagh. This is one of those rare bonus action cantrips, and with the casting of this spell, we transform a club or quarterstaff into a magical weapon that does D8 base damage and uses our wisdom modifier instead of strength for attack and damage rolls. There are some unmistakable similarities of this cantrip to Magic Stone, such as neither benefiting from the standard cantrip damage scaling and taking the bonus action to set up. There are some important differences too. First off, you can't hand this off to someone else. This is for you to use alone. Secondly, if you were to have additional attacks, say through extra attack or Polar Master or whatever, you could use them with Shillelagh. Now, the thing is, I wouldn't expect most druids to have extra attacks through anything. Now, Shillelagh, like Magic Stone, will probably do more damage than other cantrips at very low levels. But once cantrips start scaling, unless you have some unusual feats or are heavily multiclassed, this probably isn't a great investment for your druid. Like with Magic Stone, I think before Tasha's, when we couldn't switch off cantrips, this probably wasn't a good investment for the standard run-of-the-mill druid, because level 5 is coming. But because we could switch it off at level 4, I think it's not a bad selection for those lower levels. So it's purple. But unless you have a build that is built around making this work beyond level 5, purple for those lower levels only. Thorn Whip is up next. This is a melee attack cantrip, but it is a melee in which we can make a melee spell attack, not because of range, because we can actually attack with this up to 30 feet away, meaning this has a maximum range equal to our Produce Flame, which is a so-called ranged cantrip. This cantrip does magical piercing damage, so really reliable, and does a d6 with the standard cantrip scaling, so that's a bit below average. The thing that stands out for Thorn Whip really though is the secondary effect. If you hit a creature of large size or smaller, you can also pull it up to 10 feet towards you. The up to 10 feet is important, because that means you really have 3 options. You could not move them at all, move them 5 feet, or move them 10 feet, and unlike with the Infestation cantrip, we know exactly what direction they'll be moving, and there is no saving throw against this movement. Now, with a druid, force movement is really nice. Druids are excellent battlefield controllers. They also have several spells that can do extra damage when we move creatures into or through their effects. Now, without combining it with something else, Thorn Whip is so-so. But Thorn Whip plus druid spells, I think is quite good. This one ranks green in my book. That brings us to our final cantrip, Thunderclap is a save or take damage cantrip, and it's the only one of these cantrips that a druid can get that can affect multiple creatures, assuming those creatures are in multiple spaces. You cast a cantrip, and every creature within 5 feet of you, so friendly fire is possible, makes a Constitution saving throw, so not good, or takes d6 thunder damage, so not great damage. Damage scales with the standard cantrip scaling. There are a few other similar cantrips in the game. The Sword Burst cantrip for wizards, warlocks, artificers, and sorcerers is really similar, except for doing force damage and targeting dexterity. The Word of Radiance cantrip for clerics is also similar, except in that case it does radiant damage and you choose the targets, so there's no friendly fire. Now, not any of these 3 cantrips are amazing, and Thunderclap is likely the worst of the lot. Still, there are cases where you're surrounded by a lot of creatures, or even have more of them in your own space, and when you do, then Thunderclap is a decent option. So I do think this does rank orange, because generally I don't think it's very good, but there are occasions where it is. And that's our cantrip list. Lots of orange ranks, and that's not surprising. Cantrips, especially utility cantrips, tend to be circumstantial by nature. That's part of the reason they're cantrips. Being able to cast a useful utility spell over and over as an action, when that utility is coming up all the time, is really amazing. Thus the blue ranking for guidance. Next week, I'll be releasing my video ranking of Druid first level spells, and at that time we'll talk a bit about Druid preparations and how best to approach them. So I hope you'll join me for that. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.